Hello friends, Speedball Mike Bailey here. Welcome to another one of those videos where I talk about pro wrestling. This is the follow-up to what is structure in the context of professional wrestling, where we're going to talk about how to structure. And this is when the big brain activity starts. This is when things get really complex. I have put the links to the other videos that I've made so far in the description for this one, so feel free to go and check those out. More importantly, I want this whole thing that I'm doing to be a conversation, because that's the only way that I believe teaching pro wrestling works. Me just saying things at you does not work. So if you watch this, if you come across this, I insist that you give me feedback or share your notes with me that you took, if you took any while watching this, if anything stuck out to you as either being like new information that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise, or stuff that you disagree with, or someone has told you otherwise. Please let me know, because I want this to be an ongoing conversation. Or if you have any further questions, that's tremendously helpful as well, because really, in order for me to know which video I should make next, the feedback is very helpful, right? Because there's a number of topics that I could cover. Also, please feel free to share these videos privately, not publicly. Again, I think the information is too context dependent to be put out on main. So feel free to share them privately, but please, always with the disclaimer to whoever you send this video to, that they should also send me their feedback, notes, or some kind of return. Right. The video is also available on my Patreon, patreon.com/speedballbailey, as with all the other videos. And if you're watching this on the Patreon, thank you so much. Okay, so let's get to it. The meat of the thing. How to structure, how you structure matches. So we extensively covered what match structure is in the last video, and the answer was structure is how your match time is divided, right? You always have several constraints when building a pro wrestling match. The most important one when it comes to structure is time. So the amount of time you have, how we'll divide that will be our structure. As well, important to note that structure is simply for reference. It's for you to be able to find yourself. There is not one structure that works in pro wrestling. There are no absolutes. These are just tools. The goal is for you to be able to refer to past structures, to understand the parts of your match, the effect that they had on the crowd, the impact they had on your match, so that you're able to refer to them and replicate them, right? Because as I say all the time, replicability is what leads to progress in your professional wrestling career. If you do something that works and you don't understand it, you haven't measured it, you haven't named it, and it's just lost and you're never able to do it again, then what's the point? The goal is for when something in your match works, is good, you're able to do it again in your next match and make it better, and over the course of your career, accumulate all those little things that will eventually make making a long, complex, and exciting match very easy for you. Also, this is important to note. There's an artistic component to professional wrestling. There's also a lot of fundamental parts, a lot of mechanical parts to pro wrestling, but there is certainly an artistic component to pro wrestling. That being said, build your matches however you want. That's kind of the point of all this. But I can tell you there are a lot of things that don't work, and I think the safest route for you is to follow things that are tested, that are researched, that the pro wrestling community understands very well, and then when you have a good hold on those, you'll be able to manipulate the structure and switch it up however you want, with the understanding of context, which is extremely important, always should govern how you pro wrestle, how you make your matches, how you structure your matches. And as this is covered in the Fallacy video, but generally I will assume that most of these videos are watched by Western independent professional wrestlers. I say Western because it extends to England, Germany, Canada, the United States, even Australia. But the context in which independent wrestling happens, which is in a vacuum, meaning that most independent promotions that I have worked for over the last 20 years run on average like once a month. And that's a very long time. That's too long to build your matches in the same way that you would weekly episodic wrestling, where you can really rely on the audience having seen one match so that it impacts the match you do the next week. This is different. This is audience that shows up approximately once a month, right? And again, when you're doing Western independent pro wrestling, 90% of your matches are single matches, heel versus face. And even if it's not directly heel versus face, which I don't believe in that binary being an absolute, right? I think you'll have a face versus face, or heel versus heel, or whatever matches. I think the structure should change very little, and I think using the structure of your typical heel versus face match works 90% of the time. And as well, 10 to 15 minutes is the length of 90% of matches in Western independent wrestling, so I will refer to that. However, I strongly believe that all the principles that I'm about to go through apply globally, or at least a lot of them do. I have wrestled in many different contexts: Lucha Libre in Mexico, Japan, TV, independence, and I'm going to try to stick to mostly stuff that will apply generally. There are a lot of exceptions, but they will certainly apply to this context, which I assume is the biggest context when it comes to the audience of these videos, right? The other thing that we need to speak about once again is convention, right? Which I have defined a little bit more clearly for myself. But convention, the degree to which the average Western independent pro wrestler will understand what the fuck you're saying. There's a lot of structural elements that I use that are very common. You talk about a shine, you talk about a heat, everyone knows what that is. But if you're going to talk about, measuring fall season progression and stacks and events, even double down, not everyone is going to know exactly what you're referring to. So everything that I'm going to talk about has a varying degree of convention, and it's going to be important to do our best to keep track of that. Now, moving forward, so I want to address the three-act structure, which I think was very prevalent as a method of matchmaking 15 years ago. You still hear it sometimes. I don't think it works anymore. I don't think it's past convention. I don't think the average Western independent professional wrestler will understand what you're saying or what your three acts are. It's good in storytelling, still relevant for plays and movies. However, I think its application for pro wrestling doesn't really work. Typically, it goes against my... I'm looking for a question mark. Yeah, I don't know what it means. I don't know how to apply it. I'm not going to talk about it much. Do your research and see if you like it. Other people still use it. Refer to it. It might be helpful to them. I understand how dividing your match in 3 parts might be helpful, but I don't use it because usually the comeback in the 3-act structure, in the way that it's referred to by people who teach professional wrestling, the 3rd act is like the end of the match. And I don't believe that that's a good way to define things. I, however, in a very summative way, like to divide my matches into 2. Which is not much difference, but it's a very global, and the subdivision of the 2 parts is more important, right? The front end and the back end, right? And this is my main thesis when it comes to professional wrestling. I even wrote down the definition of a thesis to make sure that I was using the word correctly before bringing up my thesis. But a thesis, a statement or theory that is put forward as a premise to be maintained or proved, right? And this is my thesis in a very digestible way. My central thesis is that the back end of a match is what will ultimately make it memorable and or exciting for the audience. And when I talk about the back end in a very rudimentary way and general way, but certainly not an absolute, the back end is after the comeback, right? Or when the match looks like it could end. We have met the requirements to achieve something like a false finish. That is the back end, and that to me is really, again, the finish is the last thing the audience is going to see. It's going to be what they remember most. The finish is going to be the part of the match that has the biggest impact on how it's remembered by the audience. Right? So we've defined the back end. Now the front end is everything before that. The lead up to the back end, the lead up to the moment where it looks like the match could end, where everything is established, where all the important story elements of our match are showed to the audience in a way that they will be able to remember for the rest of our match, and that's very important, right? So, again, my thesis is that the back end, post-comeback, after the comeback, when it looks like the match could end, both wrestlers are sufficiently damaged, we've done everything we needed to make it look like it could end. That is really what makes or breaks matches more than the front end, right? Given that, maximizing the amount of time you spend in the back end, especially in the context of Western independent professional wrestling, but also many other contexts, is a very, very useful skill, right? It's going to mean that you have more time to spend in the place that makes your match exciting, more time to build up those false finishes, more time to build up to that finish, and more time to spend on the structural elements that will live in the back end. But that being said, the part where everything needs to be established is important. So, back end. The more time you'll spend in the back end, the easier it'll be to make your match exciting and memorable, but you can't skip steps. If you miss anything from the front end in your back end, it'll be harder for the audience to understand what you're doing, and it won't resonate as much. So that is my initial thesis. Now back to how to structure, right? The parts. When we talk about front end structure, usually that part tends to be very conventional. That is the part of the structure that is very well understood by Western independent professional wrestlers. Those are words that have been extensively covered and are pretty easy to understand. And I also think that the conventional approach is the best solution to this part, right? I think the best way, the conventional approach, is usually the most efficient way to get through this. In my years of research, I have found that there is little that works beyond this, and I use the word research very loosely. When I say research, I mean watching pro wrestling matches and doing them, not like I spend time in a lab or anything, right? But the well-known parts to the front end, right? The beginning. Every match needs to have a beginning. What does the beginning do? Establishes the dynamics, the characters in the match, who's heel or face. I find that the beginning is often skipped. Even when at seminars I ask people, how do you structure your match? As an example, they will tell me, well, it starts with the shine. And to me, the shine implies some kind of action. And action doesn't work well without the audience already understanding who the characters are, so they can keep track of what's happening. And it's also something that I see very much in real life. There is no beginning, especially when it comes to 3-ways, 4-ways, multi-man matches, all the more complex kind of matches where structures tend to be less conventional, is that people skip the beginning and go right into action. And I think that is generally a mistake. I think skipping the beginning or having the beginning bleed right into the next part without giving the audience a chance to take a beat and understand what they just saw and the dynamics that were established, I think that is generally a mistake. And again, I say generally because I cannot understate how much there are no absolutes and everything is flexible and context dependent. The shine, usually building expectations. Right? I like building expectations as a definition and a goal because it's finite. Because I find that the mistakes that people make the most with shines is doing too much, giving away too much, which goes against the notion of progression, which is what governs structure as a law. Should call it the law of progression. It sounds even more serious, but when you do something that sets the expectations for the audience, again, progression in terms of moves is very easy to understand. If I go on the top rope and do a double shooting star leg drop, then go on the top rope, the audience is expecting a double shooting star leg drop, and I do a frog splash, they'll be disappointed. The same thing happens for all the parts of the match that have action. If I do my shine and it's awesome, and it has 10 beats, ends with a dive and a top rope move, and then the next part features a lot less action, they'll be disappointed, right? I think it's very easy to do too much in the shine. I think it's very easy to overdo it and stay in that place too much, right? Then we have the cutoff, very conventionally. That's the heel taking over, right? That's the transition to the heat. Usually will begin to tell the story that will lead somewhere for the heel, right? Could be to a fallacy, could just be during the heat, depending on the structure, could lead to the finish. But whatever happens, that's a very significant transition, which transition is something we're going to talk about at length, maybe later in the video, perhaps in another video, I'm not sure. But is the transition to the heat, and what is the heat? Right? What is the goal of the heat? When I ask what is the goal of the heat in seminars, the answer that people always give me is build sympathy for the babyface. And I don't think that's a correct answer, because I think that's a very specific emotional component that you don't always achieve. I think the heat is simply a break, a rest period for both the audience and the wrestlers. I think all these parts, right, up to here, very easy to understand for like singles matches, but I think this also applies to more complex matches in the same way. I think a 4-way match, even if it's a 4-way match with all baby faces, after we've shown what all the wrestlers could do, then something happens that slows down the action, and then we need to give the audience some time to digest what just happened. I think that contrast, that balance in the slow and the fast is necessary. Very important, right? And then we've got hope spots. Again, this is the most conventional structure. I am writing down hope spots because they are very conventional. People know them. People like them. I don't do them. I very rarely use them because I think in the context of Western independent wrestling, they tend to be counterproductive because they usually have one of two impacts on the match. Either you have a bad hope spot, where you just start the comeback, then get cut back off and do more heat after. Then all you do is you end up taking away to the ultimate reaction of the comeback. Or you do your hope spot properly, with its goal, which is to build to the comeback, but then you're either extending your front end, which is fine if that's what you need or chose to do. But again, given that I want to maximize the amount of time I spend in the back end, that tends to be counterproductive. But in order to do a good hope spot, that can be difficult, and it usually takes up a lot of memory points that could be better spent elsewhere, right? I talked in the previous video about memory points being finite, and that governing our structure. That is a very good example of that. I think the best use of hope spots is to control time leading up to the comeback. And I think that is very much a old school TV thing, because I think you can also control time in the back end. But again, conventional old school television match, the comeback would lead to the finish. And usually on TV, it's not like you have 10 to 12. It's not like in Western independent professional wrestling, you have 10 to 12, and if you go 13, it's fine. If you go 15, but it was good, promoters like, all good. No, you have 10, you need to hit 10. So the easiest way to make sure that you have hit 10 is to go to the heat within 3 minutes and then wait for the ref to give you time cues. Ref goes, hey boys, 5 minutes. You do one hope spots. Ref goes, hey boys, 7 minutes. You do the second hope spot. Ref goes, 9 minutes, take it home. Comeback takes us home. Very easy to control time. Useful in that very specific scenario. But in the context of Western independent professional wrestling, maximizing your time on the back end is, I think, a better chance at success, right? And then we have the comeback, which I could and will do an entire video on how to structure and use your comeback and what makes a good comeback, in my opinion. But generally, the goal is to equalize the damage, bring back the action. Typing is hard. And take us to the back end. Right? Taking us to the back end is an important one. Again, the back end meaning that there is equal and sufficient damage for both wrestlers. Shine built up some damage. Cut off, we hurt the babyface's leg. We worked the leg for the duration of the heat. Then the comeback happened, and we gave back to the heel the damage that he gave us. Now we're equal post-comeback. On the end of that, we're at a place where it looks like the match could end because both wrestlers have taken enough moves. Right? I think that's a very important part of it and an important result of the comebacks. So when I talk about, again, these are very conventional, right? There are many exceptions. Though these parts, all of these parts, aside from the hope spots, I think are generally necessary. Again, depending on context, right? Lucha Libre. Colorful characters doing athletic moves is the premise. And really a beginning establishing dynamics. Audience, sometimes, oftentimes they do, but sometimes will not care, right? You have a very story-heavy TV match that starts with a story. You can go right to the shine. You could go right to the heat even if everything else is already established. But in the context of Western independent professional wrestling, your match happens in a vacuum. All of these parts in order to fully tell the audience what is happening. And when it comes to the back end, when it comes to the time where you do cool stuff and make your match exciting and memorable, all these parts are pretty much necessary, right? And all of this terminology is very conventional, has a lot of alternatives. Sometimes you'll hear control instead of heat, right? That's a very common way to phrase it. You'll hear high spot instead of shine. Your beginning is often chain wrestling, and sometimes people will call it that. Those are all alternative names. Cutoff sometimes called a heat spot. But that's pretty old school, I think, right? There's a lot of different terminology. Now, when it comes to the back end, this is the main issue for me with professional wrestling. If I think one thing could be heavily improved, it's vocabulary, right? And this is, when I do this bit in seminars, it always it baffles me, because I ask people to structure a match, right? Help me structure a match. And they know these parts. Everyone knows these parts very well. They're fairly well known, well researched, right? And then I ask on the back end, okay, what do we have? Finish. And then what else do we have? And then sometimes, if I dig deep, people will tell me falsies. But when I ask actually how to structure, and again, going back to our definition of structure, how our time is divided, asking people to tell me how falsies work is very difficult, right? And then those are the only things. But this has an issue. And the result is, of course, if you watch the near false versus falsy videos, this is how people will structure their match very often. Come back, my falsy, your falsy, my falsy, your falsy, my falsy, your falsy, finish. And that simply does not work, because it makes it so much more difficult to track progression. So this is what I want you to get from this video, right? My approach to the back end and how I think you should structure them. Because again, I know these are tools, no absolutes, but this is something that I started doing because I saw other great wrestlers were doing them, and a lot of them are doing it consciously. A lot of them don't necessarily have the words for them because they don't have to teach it, but it works very well for me. It works very well for all the good wrestlers that you know, and it's worked very well for other people to whom I've taught this theory. And so I have a less conventional, all those terms are less conventional. I forgot how to write conventional. Conventional, but more measured. And the measured is the part that's important, right? So we have falsies, but we need to measure our falsies. And again, this is all according to time. So when we're going to time out and build our structure, we need to weigh the falsies. We need to measure them. Is it a big falsie? Is it a small falsie? Whose falsie is it, right? Come back, heel falsie, face falsie, finish. Come back, heel small falsie, face is small falsie, heels is very big falsie, finish. Right? I think that needs to be, before you even start making the falsies, deciding how the parts are going to work, you need to measure them so that you have a goal in mind for how exactly to build them, right? Other structural elements that happen in the back end that I think are under discussed, the double down. But measured, once again. People like to do double down in the lead up to the comeback. And I think that is an option, but I don't think it's ideal, again, because we're trying to maximize our time off the back end to make our match more exciting, which is my initial thesis. And I think a double down implies equal damage. And I think it takes more to get there typically than the comeback, whose goal is to equalize the damage. So typically, double down after the comeback, I think, is a good way to go about things. I think comeback, double down, falsie, finish works very well. I think if we're talking about longer matches, and that's why I write double down measured, you can have many levels of double downs. And a thing that I use, a device that I use very often and I see work to great success in Western independent professional wrestling is using, for example, a dive spot as a bigger double down later on, right? Heat, comeback, one falsie, a normal double down inside the ring. Then we rebuild, big heel falsie. Then we rebuild to the face hitting a big dive and using that dive in the countout as a double down. I think that works really well. I think also stacks, right? My stack, which is something that I've heard people say, is a good structural element to use. Stack, usually implying that we've done falsies and we've done enough falsies to call back upon them. Let's say my Fallacy was a DVD, and then my second Fallacy was a top rope double foot stomp, and I've been using a, super kick to set everything up the whole match, right? Then I can use super kick, DVD, 1-2, kick out right into the double foot stomp that I did earlier, no cover into my next thing, and using the Fallacies that I'm calling upon to build up a stack, and that way I can have progression with the pins, right? As I talked about in the Fallacies versus near falls videos, having many near falls building up to the Fallacy and or the finish. Stack kind of implies that those Fallacies are the elements that you built earlier. You're using them as near falls to build up to the Fallacy. That's typically something you'll see in very long matches. It's a way that I like to work that we'll get to earlier. We've got events, right? Usually they're called by what they are and not events. Event is a very unconventional term, but like the ref bump, and we use that whole thing, and we use that to take us to the last moment that'll take us to the finish, right? Or a balcony dive, or a ladder gets involved, or the late match table bump, the moment when we finally set the manager on fire, or whatever happens that pays off our storyline, right? And then we've got the finish, which is easily understood what it is. Again, it follows kind of the same principles as a Fallacy, right? It should be noted, the biggest and most important part of our match. Naturally, it's the most memorable, the one that needs most attention, and it's the one that needs to have the most building up to. And again, in order for all this to make sense, you kind of have to understand that pacing in professional wrestling cannot be binary. These are not all spots that have the same speed. When I talk about your finish being the biggest, longest, and most important, that includes typically and ideally a slow lead up to your finish. And that is what makes it long, because you can't just do a longer and longer high spot. That just doesn't work in terms of cardio and in terms of what the audience will understand. Now, back to my thesis. In order to make that work, right? My thesis being, where the hell is it? Right, the back end of a match is what will ultimately make it memorable or exciting for the audience. The approach I recommend that you take for the front end is a minimal effective dose. MED. Minimal effective dose, which is a term I borrow from medicine, meaning that I almost certainly don't understand it properly. But if a patient comes into a clinic and they have a headache, I don't want to give them 1 kilogram of ibuprofen, because that would kill them. It would certainly cure their headache, right? I want to give them the least amount of medicine to cure the problem and not cause any adverse side effects. So that is the same approach I have to the front end of my match. Everything is as short as it can be. So let's say, for example, beginning wrestling, establishing dynamics, right? In order for the audience to understand, how long should that take? How long can that take? Truly, again, structures for reference, you can do anything. You can chain wrestle for an hour if you want. If you're really good at that and that's what's going to make your match exciting, that's fine. Go nuts. But again, conventional, most people, you can also chain wrestle in the back end. I think 30 seconds is enough. It's all you need. For me and for a lot of other successful wrestlers, lock up, wrist lock, cool reversal, headlock, takeover, scissors, escape. We react to what just happened. Enough. And off of that reaction, we show our characters, we interact with the audience, we interact with each other, we let everyone understand the dynamics, right? Shine, high spot, how long can that take? Again, lock up, headlock, tackle, drop down, leapfrog, hip toss, drop kick. Works every time. How long does it take? So the high spot itself is, 30 seconds, but we need a little bit of reaction and some time on both ends. So I think about a minute is a good time. Same thing, the cutoff, right? probably 30 seconds. The babyface goes for something, shows what they're going to do next. They get stopped. Heel gets damaged. Heel takes over, right? And then heat. This is the most controversial one, right? Again, hope spots, I'm not even going to give a time because that's like infinite. And the goal is to control your time. So you can make it as long or as short as you want. But the heat, one of the biggest mistakes that I see in terms of going against my thesis that the most amount of time you spend in the back end, the more exciting and memorable your match can be, is people spending way too long in the heat. I think a heat is very finite. You get your rest. The audience dies. They start chanting for the babyface because they want to see more of what they saw in the shine, and what's happening in the heat is very boring. So they start going, we want a comeback, we want a comeback. And then if you just stay in the heat, don't do anything, they get restless and they get less invested into your match, right? So I think that's very finite. And I think generally a minute and a half is more than enough. It's enough, it's fine. You should be able to be fully recovered cardio-wise within a minute and a half. You should have enough time to engage with the audience and tell whatever message you want to tell in that minute and a half. And if you don't, then you need to figure out a way to be more efficient about it, right? And then hope spots, that's kind of irrelevant. That's the goal is to control time. You can have as many as you want. And I want to be clear on this when I talk about hope spot. A terminological implication for me is that you go back to the heat after. The long, slow build up to the comeback, I think, is a completely different thing. And I think a comeback should have a, ideally, slow build up before we get to the part where we'll turn it around and then start building momentum. But I think the entire thing should be about 2 minutes. Right? So just looking at this part and the amount of time we have right now, right? 30 seconds, a minute, 30 seconds, that's 2 minutes. Then we have 3.5 minutes. Then we have 5.5 minutes. Which, honestly, as I'm looking back now, and this is something I've done before, kind of feels like a lot. Because I know that I've gotten to the comeback in a way that it was effective and worked in less than 5.5 minutes. But still, let's keep playing with those numbers as we move along, right? And go to some examples of how we will structure a match. Now, 10 minutes match. Again, it's the easiest, not easiest, but most common, most researched, most conventional match, right? So we have our beginning 30. We have our shine for 1. We have our cutoff for 30. That takes us to 2, right? 2. Then we have our heat. 130 heat. Then we have our, what did I say? 2 minutes? Yeah. 2 minute comeback. Yeah, which takes us to 5:30, right? That means now, for our back end, this is the front end, for our back end, we're left with 4:30 if my match is correct, which is a good number. Again, if my comeback was 2 minutes, right? And we need to follow progression. This is how a lot of matches would be structured poorly, where our heat would be, let's say, 3, an extra 2 minutes, and then I would have, no, let's bump it up to 4, right? So then we have 2, 6, 8. We have 2 left for our finish, which is a typical scenario. But if you follow progression, in this case, your finish is just as long as your comeback, which can be fine, but is certainly not ideal. Because again, the comeback is going to end. I'm going to need to rebuild. Then we're going to get to the audience to the same point that we were at the comeback, with a little bit more damage, and then the match is going to end without exceeding our comeback, right? Now, even if we had, let's say, a 3-minute heat and a 3-minute finish, we would be much better off, except our heat would still be too long, when a much better scenario is if we have 1.5-minute heat, 2-minute comeback takes us to 5:30, right? And then we have, let's say, a 2.5-minute double down off the back of the Fallacy, and then let's say a 2-minute double down, and then a 2.5-minute finish, right? At least in this case, our finish is the longest part of our match. Again, it would be wise to maybe even bleed the comeback right into the double down, shave a minute off of there, and then have our finish be 3.5. Even more time for the finish, even more time to rest and slowly build into it, and then build up the highest spot, the most important, longest, biggest spot in the match to be our finish, right? That kind of maximizes things. That's one option. Again, an infinity of options. We can have, we can do heat, comeback, which is a device that I love to use. It's a very Japanese device. It kind of implies that everyone has their own unique comeback, and their comeback is not a bump and feed. It implies that your comeback is a very often used part of your match that you have, right? Comeback could be a heel Fallacy, or it's just the heel uses their normal comeback as their Fallacy, whatever. But we have heat, comeback, and then we have the finish. To me, this is the easiest, most researched, most conventional. Probably this, if you want terminology, would be the most conventional way to structure a 10-minute match. And I think it's ideal. I recommend it. Again, it's one example among an infinity. Now, let's say we want to structure our 20-minute match. What changes, right? Well, so when I ask this question again, how do we structure our 20-minute match at seminars, people often say the parts will just get longer. But again, that goes opposite to my main thesis, which is that maximizing our time off the back end makes for a better match, right? This means we have an extra 10 minutes, which means we have an extra 10 minutes as opposed to 4.5. We have an extra 14.5 minutes to make our match exciting as opposed to 4.5 that we did in the 10-minute match, right? So have a beginning, our cutoff, our comeback happens at 5:30. Then let's go for a 2-minute comeback from the heel, which takes us to 7:30. Then we'll have a 3-minute double down. That'll take us to 10:30, right? And when I say 3-minute double down, that'll take us to 10:30. That doesn't mean that the spot itself will be 3 minutes. That means it'll be a slow build-up that'll take us to 3 minutes, right? And then we can have, let's say, a 4-minute Fallacy from the babyface. That'll take us to 14:30, right? We have 5:30 left, and then let's say that we have, so we could have a 5.5-minute finish if we wanted to, right? Let's why not? 5.5-minute finish will take us to 20. And again, that 5.5-minute finish implies progression. Now we could have these two parts bleeding into each other, shave off a minute, and then that would give us time to do another heel Fallacy. We could also do a 3-minute double down, and then we could do a 4-minute even bigger double down. That'll end with a dive, or maybe this one ends with a dive and this one doesn't, or maybe this one, the double down, is a big move of the top rope and this one was a double clothesline, right? Both having a slow ramp up and a lot of near falls. And then we've got 5 minutes to slowly build up, to sell, to work our way to paying off everything that we started working towards, right? And then let's say that we have a 30-minute match, right? Again, building off this structure, but we need to add another 10 minutes. Well, so now this is when we get to play around. We've got 30 minutes, depending how long you are into your career. Honestly, I am 20 years in, and I have Fallacy material for days, weeks, years. You want me to do straight falsies for 6 hours? I got you, fam. But most people in this scenario, you'll have enough time that you'll be able to stretch upon this part, right? We can do, this is going to throw my whole time off, so I'm going to have to do some math here, which might be difficult, right? We can do a minute shine, then we can do a minute of babyface control, just kind of working, getting the crowd into it, right? Which will add another minute to our match. And then our heat. Still, things have to progress, so we're going to tack another minute onto there, because why not? You can even have it at a hope spot, right? And what does that take if I added 2 minutes? So we're at 7:30 when our comeback happens, right? So that means that we're at 9:30 here. And then we have a lot of time, so we're still going to do our 3-minute double down that takes us to 12:30. And then instead, we're going to take our time and build up to a 4-minute heel false, which takes us to 16:30, right? And then we're going to take us to a 5-minute face false, where he really starts getting his shit in, which takes us to 21:30, right? And then we have so much time. So again, because it's 30 minutes, it's probably a main event, right? We can have a 6-minute event, right? See, as I'm structuring this, I'm realizing that actually a 6-minute event is too long. So we're going to have to shave some time off of there. So we can go, 2.5, 3, 4, 5, right? And that'll take me to 9:30, 2.5. That takes me to 11, takes me to 14, takes me to 18. My event, which is 5 minutes long, with a, ref pull, run in, whatever, will take me to 23, which gives me a nice 7-minute finish. Which a 7-minute finish, again, sounds absurd. It sounds like, wow, this spot is way too long, which honestly, it probably is. I will need to subdivide it and build it and organize it, and it will have more elements. It will be back and forth. It will call back to a lot of stuff. And it'll probably be slower, right? With more selling, more intensity, more fire, but still it's going to add up to a longer time. Again, following the rules of progression. Now, a 30-minute match is a rare occasion. It's a big match. There's a lot that goes on to that finish. And, in order to find 7-minute finishing sequences that work, you'll have to look at Omega, Okada, and matches like that really build up nicely. And it, again, context is highly dependent, right? And then, we could play around and structure a 60-minute match. In fact, I could just share. I might eventually the notes that I think I still have on my phone of my 60-minute match with Josh Alexander and how that was structured. And these are the rules I followed. This was my approach from the beginning, right? And I think that, again, we're talking about singles matches here, but this also applies to tag matches, where the structures are going to be more built around the tag, but the same principles of progression and time distribution still apply. And like I said in the previous video, right, convention is going to decide a lot of what you build. Skill, of course. If I have to do 30 minutes with someone who doesn't have much material to begin with, then yes, our heat is going to get longer, and the free wrestling in the beginning might get longer, and the other parts might be less planned. That's all very important. This also applies to tag wrestling. 3 ways, 4 ways. I think that this front end is the most researched way to structure a match, is the most tested, is the one most audiences are the most familiar with. So I recommend using it. I think it works very well. I think it works for all kinds of matches. Multi-man's tag matches, but also including like rumbles and gauntlets. I think a gauntlet match, even if it has 7 people, should still kind of follow these beats and the law of progression as exemplified in these examples. Now, I think the next video will be specifically on progression and kind of how to build things like a 7-minute finish or a 5-minute event or even a 4-minute Fallacy, right? Because these are very complicated, and 4 minutes, in order for you to be able to memorize 4 minutes, it'll need to have some flexibility. It'll need to have some subdivision. You'll need to understand the parts that make up the Fallacy in order for it to make sense. I also use the term Fallacy and false interchangeably. But yeah, conclusion and summation. Those are just tools and examples. These are things that I use legitimately in my career, and they have worked very well. I recommend that you use them, but knowing that the goal is to find what works for you. Find what you can use. Try stuff. And if you like it, replicate it, because replicability leads to progress, and progress leads to consistency, which is the key to success, in my opinion, in your professional wrestling career. Lastly, the goal is to find structures that work for you, understand them, to make planning easier. Again, the time thing I cannot overstate. You have a finite amount of time to make your match. And if you spend, the less time you spend on things that do not need to be fine-tuned so much, right? This structure is very basic, and you can have a version of, if you're relatively new, a version of this match for you that you are able to deploy instantly. That, you know, if you're babyface, your shine, what you go for that leads to the cutoff, your comeback, and the part of your finish, you can tell your opponent in like 4 minutes. That's the goal, right? And if that happens, if you're in this scenario, you have 30 minutes, you have an hour to plan that 30-minute match, right? Well, then probably the majority of the mechanics, the majority of the spots in that 30-minute match, you are going to need to be able to convey to your opponent within like 20 minutes so that you're able to focus on what will need to be new, right? The goal is to maximize creative output. If all the mechanics, all the moves, all the things that we normally do that we're going to do in this match, we're able to convey to our opponent quickly and efficiently, then we're going to be able to spend time on what needs to be new, what needs to be unique, what do we want to create together, how do we want to make art together, right? And that's when the artistic component of pro wrestling really comes into play, is when I have a good control on the fundamentals and mechanics. That was longer than I expected, but it's very complex, and I feel like I could go another hour, especially when we talk about subdivisions and progression, but those will have to be into other videos. So once again, if you're watching on Patreon, thank you so much for watching. If you stuck around for the whole thing, it's greatly appreciated. And if this was sent to you, once again, I insist that you send me a message, feedback, some kind of report to let me know that you watch it, that you enjoyed it, that you hated it, that you did not understand anything, or that this made it a lot clearer. But thank you so much.